important issues for women and their experiences. So I think we're now going to shift to talk a bit about, having now understood a little bit about what some of the issues and effects of the diagnosis and treatment are, a little bit about understanding how we might manage those and promote wellness and quality of life. But as with all of the other sessions today, I think one of the highlights has been the opportunity for us to hear stories from women and their family. And we're really privileged now to head this session to have Jane Power talk to us about her experience of living with ovarian cancer. And particularly, I understand she's going to talk to us a bit about her view and her understanding of wellness and how she's managed to integrate that into her life. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much. Now, I've not used one of these before, so just bear with me. Thank you. I'm just going to give you a little bit of my background before I talk about wellness for myself. But firstly, I'd just like to say thank you, and I feel very humbled to be asked to speak with you today. And as women, we have so much in common. I'm just the same as you, except that I happen to be standing up here and speaking to you, and you're sitting there listening. But we are wives, mothers, partners, daughters, sisters and friends, and a large percentage of us today have received a diagnosis of a gynecological cancer. Now, I'd just like to talk a little bit about my foundation years. My journey started when I was quite young. My mum died of leukemia when I was 4, and my brother was 18 months old. And I can still recall that time, even at this stage of my life. That's certainly a time that just has stuck in my mind, and I can just recall how much my dad cried. So it was tough growing up without a mum, and those years were quite unstable because my brother was only 18 months old and I was 4, and not one person could look after both of us, so we were sent to separate homes. So we would come back and that, but it was extremely hard. But as we know, life doesn't stand still for any of us. Then, of course, I grew up, I met my husband, we were married, and of course we focused on being able to save for our home and hopefully to start a family. But during this time, just after we moved into our home, my dad then passed away with prostate cancer. So we were in our home and thought, right, now it's time to start planning to have children. But I'd actually had endometriosis. So that had been, I'd had treatment for that, but then that caused fertility problems. So from there, I then had to go on to the fertility drugs, and then we conceived our son, and he was born, and then 2 years after, our daughter was born. Strangely enough, I didn't have any problems the second time around. But being a mum was my top priority. I knew what I'd missed out on. So I was fortunate enough to be a stay-at-home mum. And then when the children were in their teens, I actually returned to work part-time. And then as they left school, then I returned to work full-time, working in local government as a professional. But throughout my life, and I'm sure a lot of the women here today could relate to what I'm saying, is that I've always been the hub of the home. Everything seems to work around us. You know, we do a lot of the planning and decision making and help with all the family connections. Okay, once we hit 2010, we started to have some challenges. My husband was extremely ill, and he was in hospital for a period of 6 weeks. He nearly died with acute pneumonia and pleurisy. He had 3 surgeries, and I can recall after he'd had quite a few complications coming home was so far afield. And he turned to me and he was really scared, and he said, "I'm really scared, I've got that big C." Thankfully, he did strengthen, and he returned home and he returned to work. So that was good. But during that time, our daughter, who had been in a relationship for 6 years with her boyfriend, had broken up. So she returned home, and sometimes you know that can actually help, because she helped us and we helped her. And our son, he has Asperger's, so that's a significant concern and still continues to be so. But alongside of this, I was then working in a very high pressure job and quite a stressful environment. And I felt, though, that I was keeping everyone else afloat. So then I was getting back to some normality, but I started to feel unwell. But I went to my GP, who listened. He was really good, and I've heard some people today talk about how they've had issues with that, but I actually had a really good GP. I was sent for a ultrasound, and it identified that I had a 12 centimetre cyst on my ovary. I then went to a couple of specialists and ended up having to have, of course, that cyst and ovary removed. But there was of no concern. There was nothing untoward that would indicate otherwise, even though the specialist did say to me, these are the possibilities before he operated. It just went over my head. I didn't, even though I'd lost a mum and a dad to cancer, this didn't mean to me that that would happen to me. I was fit, I was healthy, I was busy, not me. So I had the surgery to remove that and the ovary. All went well. I arrived home, the phone was ringing. It's a specialist on the phone. He said, "Are you sitting down? I have some bad news. You have ovarian cancer." As I know a lot of you here today, when you hear those words, you go into a shock, you find it hard to absorb, you just don't know which way to turn. And I think one of the other parts that was quite difficult is that I had no knowledge. And I know there's women still today who don't. I didn't know anyone who had experienced ovarian cancer. So I was reliant on the medical profession, and thankfully I was referred on then to a medical oncologist who, I heard someone say before about they become your champion, and they certainly do, because you put your faith into them. But it gives you a sense of isolation. You feel different. And I went into protection mode because I wanted to protect everyone else. I didn't think about me. I focused on what the facts were. I was extremely careful what I read and who I listened to. My specialist said, "Don't go to Dr. Google." So I did. I obeyed. But I also needed to get a grip on what this meant as well. So then from that point, I had to have further tests and a CT scan, which showed all clear. And then I was scheduled for more surgery 3 weeks after my initial one. And that was because we'd already identified that I'd had a grade 3 ovarian cancer, which was aggressive, but we didn't know what stage it was. And that I would need to go on to have chemo. But then my next important part, and I'm sure some of you also could relate to this. Here comes my prop. This is Cody. Okay, so I had long dark hair, and of course it was my crowning glory. What was I going to do? I knew what was going to happen. So I actually had 2 haircuts. The first was just to here, and then I wore my wig to work because I did actually still work during this time. So people saw me with the bob. Then I finished work and had my first session, and 3 weeks to the day, it started to happen. It started to come out in chunks. I got the razor out. Out it come, all gone. So Cody here was to hide my battle scars, because as I said, I felt a sense of difference and isolation, and I didn't want to look different. So this wig became my protector. It helped me that I would look like everyone else. And actually it had a pretty good impact. When I'd actually go to the shops, people I didn't even know would regularly say, "Oh, your hair looks so nice. Have you just come from the hairdressers? Wow, where do you get your hair done?" Anyway, then I went on to continue with my chemo, and it was planned for 6 sessions. But again, I'm sure like a lot of you, yours may have been elongated too, because it takes a while for those bloods to return. So mine was over a 6-month period. But after 4, I started to get numbness in my feet, my fingers, and in my lips. So of course I reported it immediately because I did know that it was something that I should let them know. And then it was recommended that I would finish my treatment. After 4 treatments, I was on a pathway for 6. There's no way that I could get my head around, both emotionally and psychologically, to think that, I was going to be too short. What would happen if I was too short? So I spoke to them, and I was able to drop the paclitaxel and continue on and have those last 2 treatments. Then I finished. The emotions and how you feel, you've arrived on the other side. But at the same time, one thing that really struck me was that I lost time. What now? I remember my first day of wellness. It was the 12th of September 2011. The first day I didn't have my wig. I said goodbye to Cody. The physical recognition at work, not that you're looking for that, but the first person I saw said, "Wow, you look like a rock star." I'm thinking, oh, okay, does that mean I strut about or what? But anyway, I thought, okay, that doesn't sound too bad. Then I had quite a few that would say, and to just look and say, "Now we understand." Then I had one from left field at work. I was in the toilets, and a lady came in from another department and said, "Why did you shave off your beautiful hair?" I quietly spoke to her. So now I just want to speak on wellness, and I can see that my time's coming. To move into that next stage also has its challenges, and I must admit I felt shell-shocked. The expectation on you as well. I had people say, "Well, it's all over now. Get back to normal." And I had recognised that I had arrived on that side, but I still thought, what now? And one thing that really struck me was the emotional wellness and the psychosocial side of that. I recognised that I needed to protect everyone else, but I didn't allow myself to feel what was happening to me, because I was in that protective mode, which I believe stems from back from when I was young. But I really did find it helpful to seek professional help. I sought the help of a clinical psychologist who helped me to discuss my feelings, my experience and the impact on both myself and the ones that I loved. And I also found mindfulness to be extremely helpful. The impact of my cancer experience left me feeling like I wanted still something different. I didn't know what it was, but I was still trying to search. But I use days like today. I've been to a number of days like this where I can learn, grow, and hear other people's experiences, and that really has helped me. It also increased my knowledge and understanding, and to discuss the impacts and to really understand what we all do go through. I know that this experience has given me courage, and I decided I wanted to look for opportunities of how I could use my experience to enrich the life of others. I wanted to contribute and make a difference, and I knew that I'd have a role somewhere. So I started to participate as a consumer in research. Any papers that would come out, I'd put my hand up, or any surveys, I'd always participate. And then through Ovarian Cancer Australia, I actually helped with a few of their projects, including the KISS app and the fact sheet. And then I saw an advertisement for one of our major hospitals who they were looking for consumers to go on their advisory committee. So I put my hand up, and I was successful in gaining that position. I still experience feelings of doubt, numbness, and some pain and discomfort, but I really appreciate the opportunity to provide feedback to help influence an outcome. I find that extremely humbling. And reflecting on my experience, I believe I'm a better person. And I think we can always use situations for good, but we just need to look for it. I would like to close with this quote. And we can always get around that rock if we allow ourselves. And I'd like to say my appreciation to the people that have helped me on my way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. What a very powerful and important story. I think Jane's reminded us, as she takes Cody away, I'm not going to leave Cody too far, I think it's a good reminder that when we're talking about wellness this afternoon, really we're emphasising both physical and emotional and social wellbeing. And I think that the next few presentations will really highlight some of the things that we can think about in terms of promoting that wellbeing. So thank you again, Jane. As I said, we'll take questions at the end with the panel. So if you could just note questions that you may have for Jane and also for the other speakers. So I'm now going to introduce Associate Professor Sandy Hayes. Sandy is an exercise physiologist and Principal Research Fellow at the Institute of Health and Biomedical Innovation at QUT, where I work as well. Sandy's program of research really draws on her own experience as an exercise physiologist and training, and she's done a lot of work in terms of trying to understand women's concerns and how, in particular, physical activity can contribute to promoting wellbeing. So join with me in welcoming Sandy to the podium. Thank you.
Where did it go? Great, thank you. Thanks very much, and it is really a pleasure to be talking today. I love talking about physical activity in these kinds of forums, and I'm very keen to answer any question you have after I talk. So this talk is really about giving you an answer to some questions that you may have asked yourselves or loved ones, maybe even the doctors who've been treating you. These questions include: what can I do to improve my survival? What can I do to cope with treatment better? What can I do to return to optimal health and quality of life and to optimise my chances of not getting cancer again? So hopefully, come the end of this presentation, you will develop an understanding of the role of physical activity in terms of answering these questions. I think the previous speakers have done a lovely job of highlighting survivorship concerns, and they've helped me out in this regard, in that I don't need to spend too much time on it. But to talk about the role of physical activity, we actually need to keep these things in mind. We also need to acknowledge that survivorship concerns are vast and varied, and I think that's not something that will be too hard for any of you to appreciate. But they include both physical and psychosocial type issues. They range from things like reduction in functional status, fitness, overall health, psychosocial issues such as poor body image, depression, anxiety, fatigue, peripheral neuropathies, arthralgias, myalgias, sleeping concerns, cognition concerns, and so on. Any one of those concerns occurs in individuals that have gone through treatment for cancer by around at least 20%. But rarely do these issues sit in isolation, and instead what tends to happen is that the presence of one concern, and I'll use fatigue as an example here, ultimately starts the ball rolling, and it will influence the risk of developing a whole host of other concerns. So when we have fatigue, and I think it was Michael who put up the slide that about 40%, at least 40% of people experience fatigue during their chemotherapy, the first thing that fatigue leads to is this lovely decline in physical activity levels. That's really unfortunate, because keeping physical activity levels up will actually help us keep our functional status, our fitness up. So fatigue leads to this decline in physical activity. Ultimately, that means that we now are in a reduced functional state, and doing tasks become harder, so that in itself will increase fatigue. But it will also influence sleeping issues. I've already said functional status, and it increases risk for things like arthralgias, peripheral neuropathies, and bone outcomes. The point, though, is it's actually not fatigue that increases the risk of those things, it's actually the decline in physical activity levels. Michael touched on this as well, and that is that even 6 years post-treatment, treatment-related concerns remain common. And you can see this is actually data from a breast cancer cohort, which means that it's a complete understatement of what women with gynecological cancer, in particular ovarian cancer, what they look like. But we have women with breast cancer, 60% of them 6 years post their diagnosis of breast cancer are reporting at least one treatment-related concern. And I'll make the point of saying that when we compiled these data, we threw out concerns that were rated as mild. So this is moderate concerns, even though we know mild concerns can severely influence quality of life. So we've got a very conservative looking proportion here, and particularly conservative if we're trying to translate that into the gynecological cancer context. Okay, so this is where I get a little bit more excited. And that's when it starts to become talking about the role of physical activity as a form of adjuvant therapy for cancer. It's actually, exercise is considered a form of medicine. It is considered a form of evidence-based medicine. So someone asked the question in the last session, what evidence have we got for other approaches outside of the typical treatment that we get for cancer? Well, we have a huge body of evidence that clearly demonstrates the role of physical activity and exercise post-cancer. Now, the thing about exercise as a form of drug is that rarely does it come with an adverse effect. So if you get given a drug for example, trying to control nausea, it has, and Michael already highlighted one of those effects, it has a flow-on effect that it might cause another issue such as constipation. This doesn't happen with exercise. If a side effect happens from exercise, it's usually because the dose that the person is doing with respect to exercise is just a little bit too high. So if we modify the dose, we should get rid of that side effect. Now, the kind of side effects that can occur that might be as a consequence of inappropriate dose might be something like a musculoskeletal injury. It tends to be an acute event that with rest and recovery we can overcome. But the risk of that side effect is very low when exercise is done at an appropriate level and prescribed at an appropriate dose. The other thing that makes me particularly excited about exercise as a form of medicine is that it actually has the potential not just to influence our physical issues such as adverse changes in body composition or fatigue, but it has a huge role to play with respect to psychosocial issues such as depression and anxiety. And so it crosses the spectrum of quality of life. It doesn't just influence our physical health. I think this graph is, I put it up here because I think it's an easy way to really bring home how important exercise is post a diagnosis of cancer. And I'm using fitness as an outcome, which is a very academic term, but I could put here fatigue, or I could put quality of life, I could put anything, any kind of adverse effect here, but fitness is one that's easy to explain. This is the point of diagnosis, and for people who are diagnosed with cancer, whether it's gynecological cancer, breast cancer or any kind of cancer, we could assume that at the point of diagnosis, mean fitness is about aged matched kind of levels. That's actually a pretty bad assumption because there is an increased risk of getting cancer with being overweight or obese or physically inactive. So typically, more often people come at a cancer diagnosis and they're either overweight and or physically inactive or insufficiently active, which would mean mean fitness levels might be just a little less than their aged matched norms. During the treatment period, in the absence of exercise, which is what typically happens, we see this massive drop in fitness. Now, this degree of decline is actually about equivalent to the typical 10-year age-related decline. Now, maybe that's not too surprising to people in the room because it's not too uncommon to hear someone say, in the past year since my diagnosis of cancer, I feel like I've aged a decade. And we actually can see that when we measure things like fitness. Once treatment completes, is finished, there is a natural improvement in fitness so that you do regain some of your functional status, except that rarely will you regain pre-diagnosis levels, and these levels are typically now well below aged matched norms. You'll continue to experience typical age-related declines in fitness, except it happens at a much steeper rate. Now let's throw physical activity, or in particular exercise, into the mix. And this graph has come from findings from randomised controlled trials that have recruited individuals diagnosed with cancer. Some of them have been put into an exercise intervention and others have gone through usual care. So this line represents those in the control group. This line represents those in the exercise group. During the treatment period, and I'm talking about during chemotherapy, we can actually improve someone's fitness levels. So we actually go better than just keeping it stable. We can actually improve someone's fitness levels. Once they finish, we can build on these improvements, continue to improve them, get them up to a level that will be well above aged matched norms. We're not that great in Australia. Most of us are overweight or obese and physically inactive. And then we can actually slow that typical age-related declines, except it takes effort, it takes planning, it takes regular exercise. There have been over 100 randomised controlled trials involving people with cancer, either during treatment or beyond treatment. It is true that less than 10% of the people involved in those trials have been diagnosed with gynecological cancer. That is changing. Ovarian cancer, people with ovarian cancer have been involved in exercise trials conducted here in Australia, and we have a trial called ECHO that has been funded by Cancer Australia and Cancer Council Australia that specifically is a randomised controlled trial involving exercise during chemotherapy for ovarian cancer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So while less than 10% of the population that have participated in these trials have been women with gynecological cancer, there have been a whole host of individuals recruited. It's overwhelmingly women with breast cancer who've participated in these trials, but we have had people with advanced disease, colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, leukemias, and so forth. The evidence is consistent. It doesn't matter who we are looking at. There is a host of benefits that come through the integration of exercise during and following treatment for cancer, and they're all listed here. One of the ones that I just want to pay a little bit of attention to is this potential that exercise can help improve adherence to chemotherapy. And we've had two of our speakers earlier today highlight that actually receiving the optimal dose might be important for outcomes. In one breast cancer trial, so this is an outcome of interest in clinical trials that we need to pay more attention to, but in one breast cancer trial, those in the exercise group were able to adhere to their chemotherapy better than those in the control group. And I think this is potentially one of the mechanisms by which exercise may assist our standard therapies to actually work well. For a very long time, we thought that the benefits of exercise was all about treatment-related adverse effects and the subsequent impact on overall quality of life. However, in the last 5-ish years, we've had findings from what we call cohort studies, so association studies, not clinical trials, association studies, that have demonstrated that actually those who exercise post-diagnosis will experience improved survival, and it's as a consequence of the fact that their risk of developing other chronic disease, which they may be at greater risk for as a consequence of the treatment they've received for their cancer, as well as potentially a whole host of other reasons, but their risk of developing things like cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, diabetes and hypertension is reduced. So this isn't too surprising for those of us who've been involved with the benefits of exercise for the last 20 years in research in this area. But what is particularly exciting is the findings that have come from with respect to survival that's very specific to cancer. And we've seen that those who exercise post-cancer actually can improve overall survival and disease-free survival. So it's quite specific to cancer as well. Now, this has kind of been the most exciting finding in the exercise literature in the last few years. And just last year, we had findings from a Canadian study involving women with breast cancer again, that looked at, so this was an exercise study that involved a 6-month exercise intervention during chemotherapy for breast cancer. Some years after that, they went back and followed their cohort, and they found that those in the exercise group had, 83% of those in the exercise group had 8-year disease-free survival. 8 years disease-free survival for the control group was 76%. Massive difference. I will say this is not powered, meaning this is not statistically different. So this is really a look at the data that just all this does is really highlights that what we've seen in our cohort studies is very promising in terms of showing through in the clinical trial setting. There's two particular clinical trials that I think are worthy of mentioning. We have what's called a challenge trial that's led by one of the investigators that is involved with this study. The challenge trial involves people with colorectal cancer, and disease-free survival is a primary outcome for that trial. And I'm leading the ECHO trial, the exercise during ovarian cancer trial here in Australia, with disease-free survival as an outcome. But if you go back and you ask the patients who've been involved in these clinical trials what they think about exercise during and following treatment, they'll tell you that exercise is the one thing that helps them feel normal. It's the one thing they get to control when the rest of their world is out of control, and it helps them do normal things normally. And I think we really can't overemphasise the importance of those kinds of statements. So cancer diagnosis has been considered this teachable moment, except we're not really doing a good job of capitalising on that, because what typically happens is the majority of survivors will stop exercising at the point of a diagnosis or during the treatment, and they'll fail to regain their physical activity levels once treatment's finished. Now, some of the reasons why that occurs, one of which is fatigue. It does seem counterintuitive that if you've got fatigue, you should be physically active. It's very difficult to get your head around that. But I can tell you that the one thing that will exacerbate fatigue is becoming sedentary. And the one thing that we have evidence for that demonstrates can stop fatigue and reverse fatigue is physical activity. There are a host of other reasons why people aren't active. It might have to do with they just don't know what to do. It might have to do with the fact that their family is telling them this is the time to rest and recuperate, not be physically active. It might have to do with fears of exacerbating fatigue, fears of creating a treatment-related adverse effect such as something like lymphedema. But on top of that, there are the usual issues that I deal with when I'm trying to get my mum active all the time, and that is I don't have the time to exercise, or God, I really hate exercise, it's pretty boring and I'd rather not do it, or it's stinking hot, the last thing I'm going to do is go out and walk. On top of that, there are cancer-specific issues. If you're wearing a wig, it's pretty hot. Any heat issue is just exacerbated by wearing a wig. For women with breast cancer, wearing a bra can be an issue if they've got radiation treatment. If you've got lymphedema, you need to wear your compression garments during exercise. So these are things that make exercising more difficult. But I will say that they are all barriers that can be overcome with some planning. And this is really not about you sitting here thinking, oh, crikey, I really should have done more, or I should be doing more. This is not about guilt. This is about giving you information that hopefully will help empower you to take back some control, and about really making you put exercise on the agenda. Plan it, determine what is a realistic starting point for you, and slowly build from there. I'll finish, I think, with this slide, which is just to highlight what are the national recommendations. What should people during and beyond treatment for cancer be doing? They should be trying to achieve national physical activity recommendations, and that's about 150 minutes per week of exercise. Now, if you're not there, that doesn't mean that as of today you're going to get there. You've got the rest of your life to exercise. This is about starting at an appropriate level and slowly building from there. If someone says to me, what's the best type of exercise that I should do during treatment? My answer will be whatever type you'll actually do. I don't care what it is, just do something. How much should I do? Something, anything. It's better than nothing. That's your starting point, build from there. How intense should I be exercising at? Again, I don't care. Just move. If you're puffing and huffing a little bit, great. If you're not huffing and puffing but you're moving, I'm still pretty happy because it's a starting point that you can build from. As I highlighted, the side effects from exercise are rare. They're typically acute in nature. If your symptoms are getting worse and you think it's because of your exercise, then you're probably doing too much, and it is one of those red flags that means you need to be talking to your treating team about this. Start slow and build slow. I was going to finish with one point, and this wasn't it, but I'm going to finish on it with it. Exercise is more difficult than popping a pill. It is more difficult than rocking up to your treating professional and saying, I'm here for my treatment, go for it. This is something that you actually have to think about, you actually have to plan, you actually have to find a way in which you're going to integrate this into your daily life. It can be done though. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm sure you've all got lots of questions there about the practicals, because I think Sandy's so true. All of us know it's actually, this is much harder than actually taking a pill, but it can be done, and I think Sandy's studies are really showing that, the importance of us taking note of some of these things. So I'm sure you've got lots of questions, but let's now move on to the emotional wellbeing side of things. And although Sandy did highlight the link between physical activity and emotional wellbeing, but let's delve a little bit deeper into a whole range of issues. Unfortunately, Carrie Lethborg isn't able to be with us for this next presentation, but Jane Fletcher, our next presenter, has kindly agreed to cover a range of topics for us. So Jane's going to take us through a number of issues around coping, around managing relationships, and around specifically some issues around therapies like mindfulness and approaches like mindfulness and how they may be beneficial. So let me introduce Jane. Jane's a health psychologist, and she runs a specialist psycho-oncology private practice at Cabrini Health here in Melbourne. She's deputy head of the Cabrini Monash Psycho-Oncology Research Unit and holds an adjunct appointment with Monash University. She works both in private practice and is the immediate past chair of the Victorian Cooperative Oncology Psycho-Oncology Committee and a member of Palliative Care and Gynecological Cancer Committee. So again, we're very lucky Jane has a great deal of expertise to share with us this afternoon. Thanks, Jane.
Now, there's a reason I'm getting a glass of water. I'm recovering from whooping cough, so I'm very hopeful that I'm actually not going to have a massive coughing fit. But I know there's probably a doctor in the house, so we'll be fine. It is with a bit of sadness that I've doing this presentation today. I know Carrie would have loved to be here, and I've just had a little text from her, and she is very regretful, but circumstances beyond her control. So it's a delight always to present to individuals who've had cancer and their support people, and I see some support people in the audience. I'm going to talk about 3 things today, and if you can time me for each of the 3, because they're sort of broken up into 3 slots, that'd be great. You may get sick of me after the end of it though. My first task is to talk about managing relationships after a cancer diagnosis. Raise your hand if you haven't had any issues with family or friends, with people saying inappropriate things, doing inappropriate things, causing great distress. If you've had an easy ride, put your hand up, please. 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 people. So it's important, I guess, to set the scene in saying that it's hard work for the people around someone who's had cancer, just as it's hard work for the individual. And why is that? And it is because of our uniqueness, our individuality, of the way we deal with trauma. It's important to understand that a diagnosis of ovarian cancer is a traumatic experience, and we would consider it from the psychological literature a traumatic life event. And in saying that, we do that in our own way. We cope in our own way. We cope in our own time, and it's a completely unique experience to each of you as an individual, and to the support people, and to us as health professionals as we relate to you. And it's based on so much of what makes us us, our previous life experience. We used to think that the more trauma you had in life, the more trauma you could cope with. We're now recognising that there is a limit to the trauma that people can actually endure. That yes, trauma does make us stronger, but there is a point when the straw breaks the camel's back. We know that your coping and personality style or traits play a huge role in how you deal with a traumatic experience. All of us are aware of our individual personality traits that may have some flaws, the ones that we like to keep under wraps. I certainly know the ones that I do. There's nothing like a traumatic event to bring those to the front, where we might be perhaps coping in ways that are different, that are unusual for the people around us to see. We also have to recognise the role of our individual social supports. We used to think, in the literature, that social support was the gold standard. And we used to ask questions like, are you married? As a measure of social support. Are you in a relationship? As a measure of social support. Not recognising that there's positive and negative social support. And as individuals, surrounding yourselves with people who provide you with the positive social support is so important. The diagnosis of ovarian cancer, treatment, moving into a survivorship phase is very much like a roller coaster ride. It could look like this one, it could look like this one, but my point is, it's your roller coaster. It's unique to you. It's your roundabout. It's your cycle of grief and loss, whatever words we put around it, that as an individual you're going to move through different stages, you're going to find some things difficult, some things easy, and it may be very different to the person who's sitting next to you who's had a very similar experience. They may be like hurdles, and sometimes we get stuck. Sometimes you just don't know where to begin. And just when you think you're over, maybe you're not. I don't know why rabbits made a big role in this talk today. But the thing I'm coming to is with relationships is to get over that hurdle. And sometimes we just need a boost. We need the people who are additive in our lives, the supportive people, so that we can jump the hurdle. What we don't want is to feel squashed, suppressed, or to feel weighed down by other people's grief response. How many of you felt that when you were diagnosed that you had to put on the mask, that you couldn't truly grieve what was happening because you had to look after everyone else who was around you? My mum's diagnosed with breast cancer, not a gynecological cancer, and her reaction was, I can't have cancer because I'm a carer for my dad who has cardiac disease. That was her first reaction. And that's a very common reaction. This is another very common reaction. Denial. A very, very useful coping mechanism in the short term, but not in the long term. And sometimes you'll find that there'll be people who will be running for the hills. How many of you have found that you've had friends or family members who you thought would be there for you, who you thought would be there to support you, and they took to the hills, you didn't see them? And it's not about you, it's more about them. It's about their inability to cope. And then we think what happens is that time passes and they can't make that phone call. It's very difficult then. What will I say? I haven't called. And sometimes those relationships are unrepairable. Sometimes they're not. This picture is about social isolation, and I use it in most of my talks, and it comes from MoMA in New York, and I had the privilege of going to Sloan Kettering, one of the leading centres of in psycho-oncology a few years ago. It's called Christina's World, and it really represents to me how sometimes we can be so close to home, surrounded perhaps by a loving family in that house, but still very isolated because of the uniqueness of the experience. It's one of the reasons why days like today, where you get to talk to other people who've had a similar experience, are so powerful. But the relationships can also bring out anger, frustration. How many of you have said things to someone who you care about that are not actually normally something you would say, or acted in a way, those personality traits that have come out, those ones that you really try hard to modify, that have come out in a way that you've been surprised about? And perhaps it's led to tears or grief, or perhaps a sense of sadness. I think the reason why it's difficult, the reason why relationships are hard, is because there's changes in the way you are in your social roles, doing different things in the relationship. Sometimes it's about being dependent on other people to do things for you. Women like to be independent, don't we? We like to be multitaskers and have all the balls in the air. And then when we can't, it's frustrating, it's hard. It's very hard to allow someone else to help us sometimes. Sometimes it's about a financial change in situation of losing that independence. Sometimes it's an occupational change, but again, that social isolation and family and friends just not understanding because it hasn't happened to them. And Michael touched very briefly on changes in intimacy. And we haven't included time for a discussion about sexuality, but it's important to remember that those relationships, those intimate relationships, can be changed. Sometimes that's not necessarily for the worse. Sometimes it can be a reigniting of a relationship, but sometimes not. And sometimes the sexual issues emerge. And sometimes we're just rowing in the different directions. The difficulty in the evidence tells us that relationships that had problems before a cancer experience, regardless of the cancer, are unlikely to survive after the cancer experience. Sometimes people will rally, and if they get good quality relationship counselling, Relationships Australia is probably your first point of call, going to your GP, but seeing someone who has specialist skills in relationship counselling is likely to succeed. The problem is people go to relationship counselling too late, and so the success rate is very, very low. And we end up with the Lunic cartoon. The difficulty for new relationships, and I think that it's always important to remember that single people will face additional challenges who have a cancer diagnosis, an ovarian cancer diagnosis in particular, because of the psychosexual issues that then represents. And it's very, very difficult for someone to work out what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. And the example I use, and Julie knows this story very well, is actually not from my cancer experience as a clinician. It's from my experience in my PhD research in organ transplantation, of all things, in working with a young woman who had a lung transplant. And she was a doctor herself, and she had met someone. She was in her early 20s. And it was about a year post her transplant, and she met this young man. And she knew she had to tell him that she'd had this massive operation, and that, that they were going to enter into an intimate relationship, and she had to tell him that this wasn't a curative treatment. She had to go into all of this great detail. And we role-played what she might say and spoke about how it might feel, and basically she went away and was coming back in a couple of weeks to tell me what had happened. And as a therapist, one always looks forward to sessions like this, and especially when the opening line to you is something like, "You are not going to believe what happened." And I said, "Tell me what happened." And she said, "Well, I told him, about how I had these scars and how I'd had this transplant and the whole story. And he took it all in, and he listened, and he was very attentive. And then at the end he said, 'That's really interesting. I've had my appendix out. Do you want to see the scar?' And as it turns out, he was the right person for her. They went on and got married. And for me, I guess, for anyone who is single in the audience, it really brings home that the person who gets it, the person who understands you, loves you for you no matter what happens to you, and the person who loves you for you is just celebrating the fact that you're in their life or sitting next to them. And that's a really powerful thing. And if someone doesn't get it, then they're not the right shoe, and you need to try on another pair. Jane, in her talk, mentioned this, raised this point about family and friends wanting to perhaps move on, the move on statement. You're all better now. You have to put this behind you. Anyone heard that one? Yeah. It's time to get back on with your life. Like, what have you been doing for the last 12 months or so? The difficulty is understanding the experience is part of your individual identity. It comes with you whether you want it to or not. And we have two ways of thinking about it, don't we? We can think about it like the monkey on our back, or we can start to incorporate it into who we are as individuals. And I think that is perhaps the healthier way. I often draw with my patients a circle and ask them to think about the wedge that their cancer experience might represent, because it does not represent all of you. It's a part of the pie. But you can't leave it behind. And that's very difficult for family and friends, anyone who hasn't had an experience like this, to fully understand. We've touched on the idea of normal and what that might mean, and for those at the back who can't read this is my favourite slide, given to me by one of my students, and I think because of the hair, maybe it is me, I'm not sure, but it says normal is a cycle on the washing machine. I guess if nothing else, thinking about the uniqueness of you is so important, and then how we fit in with other people given their individual uniqueness. So how do you manage to make relationships survive? It's all about communication. It's all about talking and, most importantly, listening. We need to make sure that we're actually speaking the same language, that we're not speaking orange and green. I know when I'm talking to my partner, a lot of the time I know that he's talking apples and I'm talking pears, because we come to the end of the conversation and we haven't got very far. So it means that we just have to go back. We have to go back and start really listening to each other. And this one says, it's best to pretend people are actually listening to you. Most importantly, it's actually best to actually do it. Communication's a really difficult thing to explain, but such an important thing about the relationships we have with other people is to also remember the mediums we're using when we communicate. How many of you communicate in text messages? Intimate information to people in text messages. Please don't. Please stop. Because it's so difficult to actually get the nuance of what's happening. Your eyes are drawn to me, and they're drawn to this part of my body, because this is where all the signals come about communication. That's the part of my body that your eyes are drawn to. They're not drawn to my feet when I'm talking. They're drawn to my face because you're looking at my face for my expressions. I'm a gesticulator. I would be mute without my hands, and you're aware of that. My shoulders, my whole body moves when I speak, and that's relaying information that you don't ever get when I'm texting, when I'm emailing, or even when I'm on the phone. So the most important information that we can actually deliver is when we deliver it face to face, engaging with someone and really listening to what they're saying. And most importantly, making sure that they've heard what we said. So that idea of reflective listening and then summarising back what's been said. Therapists, we do it all the time. We say, so from what you just said, I get an understanding that this is X and Y and Z, or that you're feeling like this. And we feed it back. We often get it wrong, and you tell us, and you say, no, that's not quite right. And we go, okay, so you tell me. Being the naive investigator, asking lots of questions, making sure someone understands. If you do nothing else, that's going to help your relationship. It is a process of adjustment, though. It is of not trying to protect other people by avoiding those negative emotions, not getting stuck in that prison of positivity, of thinking that you need to be positive all the time to protect the other people in your life. Acknowledging those losses, not avoiding them. Taking the support you need from others, sharing feelings and not avoiding. Avoiding the mask. What helps? Not keeping secrets. Choosing your supports carefully. Additive people, not the subtractive people. Surrounding yourself with those people who actually restore and renew. And making it very clear what people can do to help. How many people have had someone say to them, please let me know if there's anything I can do to help? And how many of those people have you actually taken up on the offer? Very few. Those are the people who need direction. They don't know what to do, so tell them. It will be really helpful if you could. And using the resources that are available. You have made connections with people today. Exchange phone numbers, exchange email addresses, speak to each other, catch up, use this network to support yourselves. Because I have worked with hundreds of women who've had ovarian cancer, but I certainly do not know what it's like to have had ovarian cancer. So each of you do, so you can be your own support network. Support groups and peer-to-peer support. you need to be able to process what happens, and you need to be able to do that with the people who surround you in your circle. There is no point in you processing the experience and leaving your partner behind who isn't processing. So the idea of making meaning of something in a way happens as a couple. It happens as a family, as you make sense, as you sit down and talk about it. And sometimes this is talking about the hard stuff. I'm going to talk about, my next talk is more about the uncertainty and how you cope with that. Relationship therapy, as I said, so important, but listening and really listening. And those close to you may never fully understand what you've been through or are going through, but if you ask them to listen, truly listen, I don't want you to give me any advice, I just want you to be my sounding board. They may actually have an opportunity to hear. And maybe they move from this to this. And perhaps even a bear hug. Hugs are so important. They improve our intimacy. They also release a substance called oxytocin, and it is one of the most important feel-good chemicals. And if you're not in a relationship, there's nothing like a good old self-hug, to give ourselves a hug to release oxytocin. We do it all the time, just by touching our arms. When we're uncertain about something, we rub our hands together. All of those things that we do when we're touching ourselves are about releasing oxytocin, and it's a very powerful chemical. So there's nothing like a self-hug, but there's nothing like a bear hug. I'm going to move on. It seems very strange not sitting down, but I'm going to move on to my next bit that I'm going to talk about, which is coping with uncertainty. And this is probably my particular area of interest and expertise. Each of you who've had a diagnosis of ovarian cancer, or anyone who's had a diagnosis of a serious illness, has something dramatic that's taken away from them. And it is the illusion, and I talk about it as an illusion, of certainty of future. For anyone who hasn't faced their own mortality, they're oblivious to it. Well, they know they're going to die at some point, but they haven't actually looked at it. Think about that day that you were told that you had cancer. And for most of you, thoughts would have gone through your mind about, what does this mean for my life? What does this mean about my life expectancy? Will I die from this disease? What does the future look like? Will the bridge hold my weight? And the roller coaster. And it brings out primal emotions, fear, horror, terror, and isolation. And this one, particularly common, what time of the day? 2 a.m, absolutely. And isolation. And perhaps even depression. As Michael said, mood disturbance is very common. Up to a third of people with a diagnosis of clinical anxiety, perhaps 25%. The statistics are very hard to get because of the measures we use. We know it's a significant problem, we know it's underreported, and we certainly know it's undertreated. And there's lots of good treatment available. But look, why is it difficult? Why is living with uncertainty difficult? And it's difficult because of our primal emotion, our fear response. This is our survival mechanism we're talking about. This is an emotion that's induced by a threat. Someone walks into this room now and starts screaming, we're all going to react in a very similar way. We're going to become physiologically aroused. We are getting ready for the fight and flight, or perhaps freeze response, but we are becoming physiologically activated. It's our survival mechanism. When you're told you have a cancer, you're the little frightened dog. Your brain's perceiving a threat and it's activating the body into action. And it's doing it by producing a whole range of physiological responses that make us activated. They cause us to feel sick, pupils to become dilated, large muscles become activated, and we're ready to go or to run. The issue is, when does the threat ever go away? When do people ever really feel truly safe again? And that's the difficulty. I think what happens is that there's a new normal of physiological arousal that's a little bit higher than it was before. The baseline has shifted. But we have to remember that fear is a learned response. Kids aren't afraid. No one had ever learned to walk if they were afraid, would they? Kids learn to walk and they fall over lots and they hit their heads. And our response to how they fall is so important, isn't it? If we run over and we go, oh, you poor darling, if we go, that's okay, get back up and have another go, we have an opportunity to program them. But it's a learned response. The fear of recurrence is one of the most prevalent long-term psychological consequences of a cancer diagnosis across the board. And unlike other fears, it may not reduce over time. Hamilton calls it the chronic fear of recurrence because it's chronicity. But what are we actually afraid of? And I guess we have to think about mortality, about our own death anxiety. Becker brought out the term death anxiety in 1973 in his book called Denial of Death, which he wrote about it being our primal source of concern. Recognising that for most phobias, most fears, death is actually the thing we're afraid of. We don't like heights because I could fall and I could die. I don't like small spaces because maybe I might not be able to get enough oxygen and I could die. I guess when someone's diagnosed with a cancer that, like I said before, death isn't necessarily something that's off in the future, it's something that actually could happen. Even though it was there all before, it's an illusion of certainty of future that's been shattered. It's not a reality, but it's suddenly there. What we know is accurate information, this is why today is so important, will actually reduce anxiety. But the most important focus is actually happening right now. No matter what your diagnosis is, no matter what your prognosis is, you in this moment in time are no more dying than I am. This is not what's actually happening right now. And this is where the concept of mindfulness comes into play that I'm going to talk about last. But how we cope with anxiety, how we cope with fear, how we cope with our death anxiety is by staying in the moment and facing what happens in the future when it actually happens, rather than now. So, how do you do it? One of the most important things we have at our disposal is cognitive behavioural therapy. There is high-level evidence for the use of cognitive behavioural therapy in managing fear and anxiety, in managing depression. And this slide is all about cognitive behavioural therapy. Change your thoughts and you can change the world because you change your perception of the way you think about things. Challenging those negative thoughts. We call them ANTs, automatic negative thoughts, as psychologists. In the background of our mind, we have automatic negative thoughts all the time. I'm scanning the room, seeing if you're engaged, making sure I'm not going to fall off the stage, I'm not going to have a coughing fit, something's not going to happen. And I've got this dialogue of negative thoughts going through my mind all the time. I'm just not listening to them. I'm not paying any attention to them, but they're there. If you have an ant on your kitchen bench, what do you do with it? Kill it. We don't go, hello, Mr. Ant, please come, bring your friends, let's have an ant party, because I really like ants and I want more to come. Because if you start engaging in your automatic negative thoughts, more will come, and we go down pathways that are certainly not helpful to us. That's why cognitive behavioural therapy is so powerful in teaching how to challenge those thoughts, how to manage them. And we do that by knowledge. What is the evidence to support this automatic negative thought? Is it actually happening right now, in this moment? Is there a different way of thinking about it? Is there an error in my thought process? And is there a different point of view? Our tendency of human beings is to prepare ourselves for the worst possible case scenario, and anything else is a bonus. Sometimes actually think about, well, what is the worst thing that actually happens here? If I carry on thinking like this, what's it going to be like for me? What's life going to be like for me? And most importantly, what can I do? Active problem solving. This is the Jane Fletcher therapy, the Nike therapy of the world, which is keep calm and just do it. If there's something that you can do to alleviate your anxiety, then do it. If that's about asking questions, getting information, talking to someone who's had a similar experience, then do it. It's the exercise philosophy. Get out and do it. Our challenge is always thinking about how do we replace fear with curiosity. I wonder what. She is my favourite superhero. Not because of the invisible plane or the lasso or any of those things, but because of the cuffs. They were silver cuffs, if you remember, and they deflected off bullets. We need to use those to deflect off the stuff that comes in from the outside, those comments that other people will say to you as you're standing in the supermarket and you're talking to them and they say something like, yeah, my hairdresser's friend's cousin, they had ovarian cancer and they died. And it feels like, as my patients have said, it feels like someone has slapped them, has hit them. Completely inappropriate thing to say, but I think what happens is people don't know what to say, so their defences go down and the first thing that comes out comes in. Our challenge is whether we take that on board or not. Whether it's like a cartoon bubble what comes out of people's mouths, because they're just words, aren't they? If our thoughts are just words, then what other people say is just words too. Because we certainly don't want to be anxiety girl, able to jump to the worst conclusion in a single bound. We need to be able to decatastrophise. Stop focusing on the one negative outcome. Wait and see and avoid writing stories, thought stories ahead of time. Looking at other possibilities. Bringing awareness to the here and now, mindfulness. Focusing on living as well as you can for as long as you can. Making meaning. There is high-level evidence about meaning-making therapies and their benefit in reducing anxiety, depression and helping individuals live with uncertainty. It's an area of Kerry's and I that we find so interesting to work in is the existential therapies, how we make sense of things. But it is the power of your individual stories. It's why today is so helpful. It was why hearing Jane's story is so powerful because it resonates with so many of you. It allows you to process the experience. Sometimes thinking about what was the hardest thing, what was the biggest surprise, and sometimes going back and then thinking how you might want to do things differently now. This point sometimes raises some controversy. Occasionally people will say to me, this experience is the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I'd question it. I'd say that there are benefits that come out of an experience like getting ovarian cancer that you find after you have had it because you're looking to make sense of it. You're looking back to say, well, you know, at least I know I've got a lot of friends around me. At least I know how fantastic my family. I know I've got a fantastic support network. But it's about putting pieces together, making sense of things. I get people to draw joy maps, and that's my homework for you for this evening, for each of you, is to get a piece of paper, draw a circle in the centre and write the word joy. And then think about in your individual lives what brings you joy, what helps you make sense of the world, those strategies that are helpful, and then do them. Make sure you do them. Make sure exercise is one of them, but do them. But exercise sometimes is strolling along a beach looking at shells. It's moving, it's just doing something. What are your favourite things? Who and what is important to you? And what makes your heart sing? We know the expressive therapy is writing. Is anyone journaling? Anyone journaling here? Yeah. We're recognising now from a brain function point of view how important journaling is as the way we encode the memory of the experience. So therefore avoiding a traumatic, encoding it in a traumatic way. So that writing of the experience is actually very, very helpful. Music, very powerful, and art. And this is one of my patients' works. It's, as she says, throwing paint on canvases, but it is a series of paintings upon paintings upon paintings about her recurrence and what that felt like for her. It is important that there are no secrets, as I said before, in choosing those supports, and just doing it. Making sure that you have adequate information and putting the good things back in and being kind to yourself. Accepting those limitations. Learning to say no and set limits. How many of you are good at saying no? No. Well, just in case, I've put it up a few times, and if frogs can do it, then anyone can do it. And we must remember that no one is Superwoman. She didn't actually exist. From a psychological point of view, there's a type of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, that this is where this comes from, and there's again high-level evidence to support the use of this in an oncological population. And it is about taking control of what you can take control of and letting go of what is not in our control. And none of us have control of what happens to us in relation to our end point. Everyone has an end point. Everyone has a life expectancy. Everyone is going to die at some point. We just don't know what it's going to be like, and we don't know when it's going to be like. And what we can do is we can write a whole lot of stories about it. And that's going to cause us a whole lot of anxiety, a whole lot of fear. And then it may not happen like that. It may be something completely different. And what we've actually done is we've wasted time and energy. I know I'm going to go over time on this one because I can make it up on my third talk, but in thinking about it, I want to tell you a story. Julie's heard this one before too. I apologise if anyone's name is Claire, but Claire is on the way to the hospital. I have given you a fact. It's a very ambiguous fact. Claire is concerned about the surgery today. That's the second fact. Again, another very ambiguous fact. Claire's main concern is that the theatre is only booked for 2 hours. Third fact. Fourth fact. Claire realises that none of this is her concern as the surgeon's receptionist. For how many of you was Claire a patient at the start? And then maybe she changed when I started talking about the theatre. I gave you very limited information, and in our heads we write stories. We don't like ambiguity. We want to know what happens. Driving down a country road, out of the corner of your eye, you see what you think's a dog on the side of the road. It's getting dark. Your brain is filling in the gaps. It's taking incomplete information, going to its visual centre and finding something that fits that. As you get closer, you realise it's a lump of wood on the side of the road. It's a log. It was an error in your visual perception. We do it all the time when we mishear things, don't we? We think we hear something, but we hear it wrong. And we do it the same with our own thoughts. When we don't have enough information, we will make it up. How many of you have had a scan and have convinced yourself that it's bad news because of the look on the person who was doing the scan for you, or as you're walking into your oncologist's rooms, have convinced yourself that it's bad news because of the look on their face? I can tell you I did that the other day with my own mother. I was convinced that she had pancreatic cancer because he wouldn't engage eye contact with me, and I know him quite well. No, she doesn't have pancreas, she has gallstones of all things. But it's so easy for us to and I'm very good at controlling my thoughts, but it's so easy for us to jump to the worst case conclusion. So we have to challenge it. What evidence do I have to support that? Because those thought stories are very powerful. I told that story about Claire at another event, and an oncologist came up to me afterwards and he said to me, "That was fantastic, that story, but I think the breast surgeon should be a female." And I'm thinking, I didn't say anything about a breast surgeon, and I didn't give a gender at all. He added it in. He made sense of it in his own way. So he filled in the gaps. So we have to be very careful that we're not making up stories. We're not filling in what we think should be there. If you think you need help, then it's available. Your GP, your oncologist, they're the best point of call. And you have choices, so choose how you live now, in the moment, and be mindful. And that is a segue into my last presentation. And I think if Carrie had been here, we wouldn't have perhaps had them back to back like this, but that's okay. How many people here are practicing mindfulness on a regular basis? Fantastic. What do you do? What sort of things are you doing? Meditation? Yeah. Anything else? Anyone doing mindfulness exercise like yoga or qigong or tai chi? Brilliant. So what is it? It is the buzzword. It is very popular at the moment, but it is very much about being rather than doing. Mindfulness is an approach to life in a way. It is about paying attention. It is about being in the moment. It is about non-reacting, being non-judgmental and open-hearted with awareness of what is happening in the now. With these most important qualities. If we go back to being the naive investigator, again, with compassion, with curiosity, and a level of acceptance of what is. Mindfulness comes from the Buddhist teachings. It's been incorporated in Western psychology for about 20 years or so, by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who has written thousands of books, thousands of YouTube, thousands of TED Talks. So always a good starting point. But mindfulness meditation is something that has become more prevalent. It is about... meditation isn't about thinking about nothing, and that's the most important thing to say. If we can't do that, our brains are too busy. Meditation is about a focus of attention. It's about paying attention to something, and it can be anything, absolutely anything. So for a moment, I'd just like you to uncross your legs. And I know some of you have some peripheral neuropathy, so we're going to bring our focus to the thumb on our left hand, okay? And I just want you to close your eyes, and I really want you to focus in on the thumb on your left hand, imagining that you're going to have to tell someone all about the thumb. So you're tracing the thumb, your mind running its way around the thumb, running its way around where the thumb's resting, what it feels like, and bringing your attention to the nail, how the nail feels as it sits in the thumb. Just tracing around the nail sitting on your thumb and what it feels like, noticing the sensations, perhaps that weren't there before, really focusing in on your thumb. And opening your eyes. How many of you is your thumb zinging? Little bit? Yeah. It's as easy as that. If we bring that in when we have a negative thought, we can distract ourselves. So it's a process of bringing the focus of attention to the now. So the focus could be on the breath, on the senses, on the body, on thoughts or emotions, or perhaps whatever's predominant in our awareness. It might be bringing our focus of attention to the colour blue and suddenly realising that blue is everywhere. But it is focus without judgment. So when we're thinking about thought, it's a focus on the thought, not an analysis of the thought. It's looking at the thought and watching it go past. For me, I imagine them like LED displays in the back of my head, like they're just going past my thoughts. And I can pay attention to them, or I can just let them go. So I'm just observing, a process of observation. What does it do, and why is it so important? And this is where the evidence comes in. So we know that it is about attention regulation. We know it brings awareness to our body. We know it's about re-regulating our emotional responses, and it has the ability to change the way we think about ourselves, but it leads to increased self-regulation. Our ability to, as we call in psychology, to down-regulate that response of physiological arousal that happens in the response to fear. So it's the capacity in a way to control our thoughts, behaviours and emotions and our attention. And why does it work? And this is where it's very exciting stuff. It's really exciting stuff. Frontal lobe, it's all about the frontal lobe of our brain. It's all about our memory and learning centre, but so important is about the hippocampus. It's about the amygdala, which is where fear comes from. So mindfulness regulates the fear response. It helps you manage your fear. So we're not this, and we're not doing that, and we're not engaging the amygdala. There's a whole range of therapies that you can try. Do your own practice, use CDs if you need to. There's mindfulness exercise. This is a yoga pose that is supposedly an easy yoga pose. And that's much more my style. Informal meditation is everywhere, looking at a tree, looking at the beach, watching the sky, looking at nature, just observing and being in the moment. It is even in washing our dishes in our sink and folding laundry, because we can also do that mindfully if we need to. Formal meditation, a practice, could be focusing on the breathing, and we've not got time to do one today. But as I said, there's a whole range of things that you can do. There are apps, but it's important to have a daily practice. There is little evidence about the amount of time. It's like exercise, just do something. Whatever you do is going to be beneficial. The best app is Smiling Mind. It's short. They have 1 minute meditations. It's free. That's another really important thing. The thing I say to my patients about meditation is, if I had a pill and I said to you it has no side effects whatsoever, it would make you feel better, it would change so many aspects of your life, would you take it? And everyone says, yes, I'd take it. The only problem is it requires you to sit still for maybe 5-10 minutes a day. And that's the only downside. That's the only negative bit. It requires you just to be. And I'll end with the Leunig cartoon. It says, you suffer from life ache. Your whole life is sore. It hurts when you move. Herbal remedy. Take 1 patch of grass, a mild day and 2 large trees. Lie on the grass beneath one tree and contemplate the other tree. Nap from time to time or gaze. Gaze occasionally at the grass. The pain will subside. Life ache cannot be cured, but you can learn to manage the symptoms. Thank you.